Good morning and a warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us for this ThinkForest webinar, which is going to be exploring the topic of implementing closer to nature forest management. I'm Rach Colling and I'm Head of Communications at EFI. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the agenda and talk to you about a couple of housekeeping issues to start off with. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and we'll make this available on the EFI YouTube channel afterwards. If you wish to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A box, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. Don't forget to say who you are. It's really helpful to know your name and organisation, and also to say who your question is directed at. That would be super helpful. And finally, don't forget to tag us with the ThinkForest hashtag if you're posting on social media. Our webinar today is going to divide into two parts. We will have opening words from our ThinkForest president, Janez Potočnik. And then after that, we will focus on the recently issued guidelines for closer to nature forest management. Our speakers here are Stefanie Schmidt from the European Commission. She's the Policy Officer for Forests in the Directorate General for Environment, and she's responsible for the follow-up of the new EU Forest Strategy for 2030. With a particular focus on closer to nature forestry, payment schemes for forest ecosystem services and forest monitoring. She'll then be followed by Jorgen Larsen, the Professor Emeritus in Forest Ecology and Silviculture at the University of Copenhagen and Professor at Nanjing Forestry University. You'll then have a chance to ask a couple of questions if you wish. The second part is our panel discussion, which is going to explore the national context for implementation. We'll have 4 panelists, and here too, you've also got the chance to ask questions and to contribute. So I think with this, let's get things underway. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Janez Potočnik, our current ThinkForest president. He is also the co-chair of the International Resource Panel and partner at Systemic. You also know him from his many previous roles, including as European Commissioner for Science and Research and later Environment. Thank you very much. Over to you, Janez.
Thank you, Rach. Dear friends, as you know, closer to nature forest management, it's a concept proposed in the European Union Forest Strategy for 2030. The idea is to provide a vision and direction for managed forests in Europe, which improves their conservation values as well as their climate resilience. The strategy proposes developing a definition and adoption guidelines for closer to nature practices, as well as developing a voluntary closer to nature forest management certification scheme. Now, related guidelines were developed by the European Commission and published in July 2023. Our event will concentrate on implementation, and you are all aware of the questions we will try to unpack today. Let me try to put the importance of the closer to nature forest management in a broader sustainability context. We learned from the history that access to and use of natural resources, land, forests, water, oil and gas, minerals, or precious metals, have been always closely related to the level of well-being achieved by nations, but also to stability and security, to the conflicts emerging from the desire to exploit and use natural resources. The whole history of the colonialization of nature was central also to fairness and equity. And lessons learned are also quite convincing to understand that changing our relationship with the rest of nature is ultimately not only environmental, but also an economic, equity, security, if you want, resilience imperative. This relationship is not stable nor balanced, and it will be resolved either with collective wisdom and cooperation or in a hard and very painful way through conflicts, hunger, pandemics, migration. This is the choice we have, and this is the real question behind the sustainability and transformation efforts. We should always keep that in mind when designing the answers related to sustainability efforts, and implementing closer to nature forest management concept is one of those important answers we have to shape in the most effective way, considering the overall system-related challenges. Important lesson could also be learned from the recently published report from the Club of Rome. I'm also one of the members there, titled Earth for All. report is introducing two scenarios. First, one, too little, too late. I guess it's a bit too little and too late to speak about it. And second, the giant leap scenario, assuming the fastest economic transformation in history. The key outcome of the giant leap scenario is that we will see negative social tipping points before severe environmental tipping points, and that equality and poverty alleviation is key if we want people to be concerned about regenerative economics and decarbonization. Anything not acceptable will not be acceptable. Social and environmental efforts must go hand in hand, which is also an important lesson in the context of keeping the interests of forest owners, in particularly smallholders, in mind when designing solutions. And more, even in the giant leap scenario, climate change stabilizes only at below 2 degrees Celsius. This brings serious predictable consequences for societies, including extreme heat waves, flooding, drought, and food security. You have all probably heard about the summer we were living through this year in my home country, Slovenia. I'm pretty sure Tomasz knows that too well. The number of disastrous days during summer, storms, heavy winds, floods, was the same as the number of normal days during my youth. And all that was accompanied by the floods even the oldest citizens were not remembering. The consequences were severe, but the reaction from the society, the help, solidarity was unprecedented. Not only from fellow Slovenian citizens, also from abroad, from all European countries. But why are we ready to show solidarity only ex post, when we are already hit by the climate effects, but not able to show the same solidarity ex ante to avoid the bitter consequences many are facing? As you know, the fight against climate change, in the fight, we basically combine two main types of efforts, prevention and adaptation. Less is done on prevention, higher will be the need for adaptation. And that lesson was learned very quickly this year in my country. The costs related to climate change are unavoidable. It is only the question, are we ready to invest upfront to avoid the costs, or will we rather wait and see suffering of many and help them when they are affected? In this case, of course, the costs are double. We can measure them financially, but also in human suffering. As the Club of Rome modeling is showing, some tipping points have already been breached, and we should get ready for what is more or less unavoidable. But are we really ready to accept this as a new normal and just better prepare ourselves to cope with the consequences? Would somebody really have the courage to step in front of the people who lost everything and tell them to just get better prepared while we intend to continue business as usual when it comes to main reasons leading to these dramatic developments? It is really high time to show more on the side of ex-ante solidarity. Lessons learned from COVID are also most interesting. If we consider something as serious, we are ready to act. But governments tend to act too little, too late, and only when all other options are exhausted. We are also ready and able to accommodate. For example, work from home, which has become in many places new acceptable normal. This would not be possible if we would want to introduce it in 2019 without COVID break. And human needs lesson, just ask yourself a question: how many clothes you needed during the COVID period compared to the period before the COVID? And then answer also the second part of the question, maybe even more important: were you more or less happy because of that? Unfortunately, one of the conclusions one could also draw is that we are obviously not yet taking environmental challenges seriously enough. To conclude, I hope messages shared in my opening will be well understood and recognized also next year, when during elections we will be deciding about the future direction of Europe, shaping the new European Parliament and Commission, and designing the follow-up of the European Green Deal vision. Let me finish with a quote from Alan Ford. This is famous comics from ex-Yugoslavia. explaining well where the established practice of the economic system is leading us. It is not the problem to drive without the brakes. The problem is to stop. Dear friends, the future will be green or there will be no future. Implementing the closer to nature forest management, it's an important conservation and prevention task, staying ahead of us, staying ahead of you. I wish you a good luck in that noble task and a useful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janez. Time now for our first speaker, and that's Stefanie Schmidt from the European Commission, who's going to focus on the guidelines for closer to nature forest management. Stefanie, over to you, if you can share your screen, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Reg, and good morning, everyone. I will start sharing my screen, and you let me know if you can see the presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. That's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, then I will start right away and maybe continue where Janez stopped with giving you first a bit more detail of the policy context in which we have developed these guidelines. They were first foreseen in the biodiversity strategy for 2030, vis-à-vis the overall ambition of the Commission to support and facilitate bigger, stronger, and better forests in Europe in terms of increasing their health, maximizing their sustainable use, as well as also strengthening their resilience via climate change. And in this context, highlighting that biodiversity-friendly forestry practices should be further developed. And that for this, the Commission would then develop guidelines, among others, for closer to nature forestry practices. This commitment was then echoed by the Forest Strategy for 2030, which also set out a first, basic definition of the guideline of closer to nature as a concept, which is set out as a set of multiple practices to ensure multifunctional forests by combining biodiversity and increasing resilience without neglecting timber-related revenues. The preparation of the guidelines was involving a very collaborative and evidence-based approach. We took a lot of time to ensure that we could discuss with all actors and stakeholders that took an interest, as well as also consulting a lot of experts and reviewing a lot of the scientific literature, which was important in the context of the closer to nature, and really trying to bring together a lot of different views and perspectives of what closer to nature could entail in terms of definition, as well as in terms of the level of ambition that should be brought together in these guidelines. To give you a brief overview what the result of these discussions and efforts were, you can see here the guidelines basically set out first a rationale why these guidelines have been brought forward, to put it into the context with the forest today, threats, challenges, and opportunities, as well as then setting out for whom these guidelines are and what they're about. Then presenting what we call a toolbox, which is a set of measures that can be done throughout the forest management cycle, followed by a set of critical enablers who will support forest managers and owners in really implementing the measures from the toolbox on the ground, as well as then also discussing closer to nature in different regional contexts, recognizing that there's a strong diversity of forest management practices, approaches, and history throughout Europe, and then also presenting a few examples of good practice to showcase that how closer to nature can work in practice. Just to outline the overall scope, the guidelines are dedicated to promote biodiversity-friendly and adaptive forest management. and for doing so to assist the competent authorities and key stakeholders at the different scales in really bringing this forward with a focus on forests that have a commercial use for timber or non-timber forest products, while recognizing that some of the principles and measures that are discussed in the guidelines might also be relevant for protected forests. We early in the discussions decided that it would not be the best way to define closer to nature with one or two sentences saying it's this and that, considering again that there's such a strong diversity of forest management contexts across Europe. So we rather went for trying to frame the concept by a set of basic considerations and principles, and therefore facilitating really to embrace all the different forest management realities that you have in Europe. And as you can see here in a nutshell, you can say that it's really building on what would be an ecosystem-based approach to forest management. The general principles for closer to nature have been based largely on a report by Bo Larsen and colleagues, which I think Bo will talk about right after me. So I will not say much more about this here, but just to showcase what are the general principles that are then setting the frame for the actual measures that we have included in the toolbox. Age classes, as well as also different structures in height and diameter, and also in terms of density throughout the forest, to really trying to derive to something which sort of reflects or echoes what a natural forest ecosystem would look like. And then as a second objective, complementing it to really promote natural forest dynamics and minimize actual management interventions as much as possible. First of all, to facilitate the natural forest dynamics, but also recognizing that in many cases this would also help to reduce investment costs in forest management. Then again, we really try to take account of the different forest management contexts, and this is why we put together also an overview of several very common practices throughout Europe, and then discuss them in terms of their main characteristics as well as their relations to biodiversity benefits in order to facilitate forest owners and managers to understand where their starting point could be in then moving closer to nature. That brings us then to the actual management toolbox that you can see here as an overview. We really try to look at different phases or aspects in the forest management cycle, starting from tree regeneration over harvest conditions, other management interventions, to then some more broader aspects like, for example, scale-specific approach, discussing from the individual tree up to the landscape level, as well as also some aspects which are not necessarily closer to nature in itself, part of the framework, but are relevant, like, for example, setting areas aside voluntarily, which can be a complementary measure, or also, for example, managing ungulate species, since their grazing pressure, for example, can be an important aspect vis-à-vis the promotion of natural tree regeneration. Knowing that in many cases the transition to moving to closer to nature will come with quite some challenges and might also lead to temporary changes in profits, in some cases maybe even some income losses from classical wood use kind of approaches. We also put together a set of critical enablers which would help forest owners and managers to really implement closer to nature measures in practice, starting with, for example, training and skills needs, knowing that across Europe, some countries have a lot of experience with the closer to nature approaches, while some other countries don't have so much experience yet, and therefore might need more training and skills focus, as well as also discussing economic viability in there with a focus on what kind of alternative income sources are possible and how they can be facilitated as a forest management strives more for multifunctional forests away from maybe a classical, very timber-oriented management approach. And through all these aspects, there's a dedicated reference to the support and enabling tools that are available at the level of the EU or at the level of the Commission, and also providing some guidance how it is possible to tap into them. And part of this critical enabler section is also a discussion, as you can see here, on forest fires, knowing that in particular when it comes to optimizing deadwood, it needs a bit further reflection in contexts where wildfires are a real issue, as well as also then looking at, for example, assisted migration vis-a-vis climate change adaptation, which you can find in the section on adaptive management and resilience. Then, as I said in the beginning, through the discussions, in particular in the Forest and Nature Expert Working Group, which was the main forum for the development of these guidelines, we also agreed that there is a need to look more into the different regional contexts that you have throughout Europe for forest management and forest conditions. So together with the colleagues from the group that volunteered or agreed to be volunteered, we then developed some regional chapters for the main regions in Europe, notably the Boreal, the Atlantic, the Continental, and the Mediterranean region, to really look a bit more into detail. Okay, what does it mean? What are challenges and opportunities on closer to nature in these regions, but leaving a lot of freedom to the co-authors to decide whether they want to develop that looking at the region as such, or by providing a specific case sample from a country from the region. So they're quite diverse in their nature and format, but we think they're very useful to show how it looks in practice, and also across the different regions, knowing that, for example, climate change will bring, for example, some of the challenges, for example, or opportunities that you see right now more in the continental region, for example, to the Boreal region as well as we go through time. Then, as I said, there's also a couple of good practice that you can look at, but I'm not going into detail here considering the time frame that we have. But just to give you also a bit of an outlook. So as Janez said, we published the guidelines in English in the classical format of a Commission staff working document in July this year. A brochure version, which is more reader-friendly, will follow in a couple of weeks, first in English, and then as we pass on, probably from the beginning of next year, then we will publish the guidelines in all other EU languages to really facilitate their uptake on the ground as much as possible. And in parallel to this, we also might organize a couple of meetings next year in spring, and also, of course, always take the opportunity, as our time schedules permit, to follow kind invitations like today to really present the guidelines to actors and stakeholders, and then also take the opportunity to discuss them in further details. And we hope that the voluntary approach of the guidelines, as well as the regional differences that are discussed, and the possibility to really start from different contexts with different kinds of level of ambition for moving closer to nature, will also facilitate a buy-in into this approach. Then, of course, in our view, the best would be if everyone fully implements all these measures that are discussed. But we know that in reality, There will be different combinations and level of ambition, considering the different context and objectives of forest management through Europe, and that also that there will be some challenges vis-a-vis that the guidelines purposefully give very limited quantifiable references, since again there's a lot of differences in European forests, but we think which then can be a challenge in terms of assessing and monitoring performance of the measures. Do they really bring the desired results? How much do I have to do? And there we hope that further exchanges and promotion of good practice will help, as well as also the upcoming work that will start next year on the Closer to Nature certification, where we will have to concretize a bit better what we actually mean in concrete terms for these different measures that we have set out in the guidelines, as well as also the work on sustainable forest management criteria that will start also next year, with the ambition to facilitate the establishment of threshold and ranges for the different aspects of sustainable forest management. Then also to highlight, the Closer to Nature guidelines can be seen as a part of a facilitating package. They have been published together with the guidance on payment for ecosystem service schemes, which we see also as a very important document in terms of supporting the move towards forest multifunctionality, and recognizing that forest owners and management also need to look at income possibilities and profitability. And therefore they're discussing in this guidance, okay, what are other possibilities and how can schemes be established, let it be public or private, to recognize efforts for promoting other ecosystem services, like, for example, water regulation, biodiversity, or of course also carbon removal, where we also put forward what you could consider a payment scheme as well, in concrete terms, with the legal proposal for an EU framework for carbon removal certification. Then in relation to monitoring performance and developments, we are also putting forward on the 21st of November a legislative proposal on forest observation, reporting and data collection, which also will look, for example, at more indicators for biodiversity, or propose them. And we think that also this proposal will, once it's adopted, support the assessment and monitoring of performance in moving closer to nature. And then, as I said already, there is a second deliverable in the forest strategy on closer to nature itself, and this is the commitment by the Commission to come forward with a voluntary certification scheme to recognize or to facilitate the recognition of respective efforts by forest owner and managers. And the work on this will also start next year. That was my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to the other presentations and discussions that we may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefanie, for introducing their guidelines and for taking a look at the wider context as well. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to Bo Larsen from the University of Copenhagen. Bo, if you'd like to share your screen.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. I'll try to do it. I have been training, so probably that will work. Let me see, like this here. Do you see it now? Is okay? Fine. Thank you. Thank you for being able to participate here. And maybe just to recall the situation during the development of these guidelines here, we put together a group of people from almost every part of the EU, even also Scotland was a part of it, to try to deliver some kind of a report from the side of science in relation to this year. That was discussed at a ThinkForest event in April 2022. And I'm now presenting some of the reflections on this report here on behalf of the whole group. Maybe I should first say a little bit about the relationship between policy and science. I think what's happening here is really how it should be. It should be, you could call it policy support and not policy advice from the side of science. So basically what we as scientists should do is to try to deliver the up-to-date knowledge about a specific theme, and then of course the politicians are going to deal with that and make decisions and make their policies. And I think that's really going in a very nice way in relation to this work here. So first of all, the group here have been interestingly studying the report and really does congratulate the Commission with this report, especially the science-based ambition, and not least its regional scale and context-specific approach. Further, its flexibility in terms of implementation, and then also really its success in achieving acceptance across country representatives and stakeholder groups. So we know this has not been an easy task because there are big differences in how you view forests in Scandinavia, in Central Europe, and in Southern Europe. So congratulations from all of us with that. But this being said, there are of course also from our side, from the side of science, some issues which I think should be highlighted. In order to achieve this unification of all the country representatives in Europe, compromises has been done. And the report gives this impression that sometimes you have the feeling of now there is one country has to really to focus upon this, and another country maybe will not be able to accept things like that. That's it. But to get everybody on board and keep them on board, it's great. This being said, we feel that often the cited references are too much governmental reports which are lacking some kind of scientific proof. Then another thing which really is lacking, and that's also lacking in our report, we must say, it is the attention to the economic aspects of the foundation of this transition, because what you have been reaching now is some kind of a acceptance among stakeholders and country representatives. But if this really should work, then we have to get acceptance from the forest owners and the managers, because they are really the people who on the place are going to make the change. And then, of course, the economic aspect is a crucial thing. And therefore, it's not enough only to talk about critical enablers. It is also important to talk about critical barriers. And for sure, the economic aspect, what will happen? How will that influence the income to the forest owners? That's really important. Another thing which especially some of our group members from the south were rather concerned about was these kind of putting agroforestry and silvopastoral systems into the concept of the close to nature management. This is a little bit awkward the problem is, as I understand, is that in many cases in Spain, in Portugal, maybe also in Italy, these classical silvopastoral systems are under pressure and threat, not only due to lack of economic functionality, but also in terms of ecological problems by maintaining them. So we feel that it's important to maybe to differentiate between closer to nature management approach and then the silvopastoral agroforestry systems, in terms of, on one hand, you want to preserve biodiversity, original biodiversity, whereas if we're talking about this ancient management system, it's more kind of cultural biodiversity you want to preserve. And I think that should be highlighted. Further, we feel that there's too little on climate change adaptation, too much about climate change resilience. And we feel that things are moving so fast now that we cannot just look into the past in order to preserve and to mimic what is there and maintain what's already there. We have to look for novel solutions and changes, and that means really adaptation. Further, we feel that the mitigation aspect of this has not been really dealt with, and we believe that there could be a key issue in terms of creating incentives for the change, if we really are looking into the climate change adaptation potential by moving towards a more closer to nature management. I'll come back to that later on. And then finally, we feel that the knowledge exchange and the collaboration among practitioners is not very well developed in the report. And I think that should be more elaborated on and worked on. But that will be, we'll come back to that in our conclusions. But the following slides here, I'll try to highlight some of the issues. One thing is, for instance, when you're reading the report, it's rather boring. There are too few pictures and too few things which will explain things in a more eye-catching way. But one of them is this picture here, presenting the climatic projections from now till 50, 60 years ahead of us. And if we look at that, I think it is important to acknowledge that climate change adaptation is necessary, especially when we are looking down to the far south in Europe. Looking at Spain, Portugal, partly Italy, Greece, and so on, the projections for the change of the climate is so dramatic that it is hard to believe that you can basically continue with what you have been doing until now, and just trying to make the systems more resilient. Here, there is a need for really adaptation and change. I think our president talked about it in the beginning here. We really see in many places that ecosystems, which till now has been working, functioning, and where you could basically also try to make them more closer to nature, that they are basically moving into completely other systems. And that has to be dealt with in such a process here. And then, of course, the issue of, maybe I should take that first here. We tried in our report to really differentiate between resistance, resilience, and adaptive capacity in relation to the 7 different principles we try to highlight in terms of closer to nature management. And what we can see here is that depending upon what we are looking into, the effect of the different closer to nature principles are quite different. And I think this has to be much more highlighted in relation to moving towards a closer to nature approach, because it is in many cases not only a question of closer to nature, but it is a question of closer to future nature, which we're going to deal with. Then we also feel that the issue of forest mitigation is hardly dealt with here. And if we look into the effect of the forest in terms of mitigation or removals of CO2, then it's interesting to look into the LULUCF scheme here, which I think in a very nice way shows what kind of influence forestry and forest have on the whole landscape balancing CO2. Of course, the agricultural crops have slightly net emissions of CO2, but you can see here that forestry has until 2014-15 has a huge impact of mitigating climate change by storing a huge amount of carbon in the forest, and also by substituting carbon released by wood use. But we can also see that from 2014 to 15, this effect of the forest in Europe are declining. And this is basically due to catastrophic events, bark beetle attack, storms, drought, and so on. And then, of course, looking into that, it is interesting to see how can closer to nature management, can this change, can that, what can you say, can that support the effect, the functions of the forest by mitigating, storing carbon? And here I have the picture we used in our report showing the structural differences of natural forest and then what we call far from natural forest and the closer to nature forest. And for sure, the untouched forest has a high storage capacity, has also a high permanence, kind of stability, but no substitution. If you look at the plantation forest, which is the classical way to manage forest in Europe, then we have a lower storage because of the clear-cut system where you have a lot of younger stands. A medium permanence because these forests are not that stable as they maybe ought to be, but they have a high substitution effect. And then the question is, of course, what about closer to nature forest management? It seems that the closer to nature forest management will have an intermediate storage. That means a higher storage capacity than the classical forest management, have a higher permanence due to a higher stability, but will also maintain a high substitution. So in this scheme here, I hope to be able to illustrate that looking more into the options of the optimization of mitigation in our forest, that the closer to nature approach might be really promising. So to come to an end, then what we, of course, as scientists would love to see was a scientific peer review of the present report. But then we feel that it is important to launch an in-depth study of the economic aspects of forest, of closer to nature forest management, not only in terms of how will it affect profitability in terms of wood production, but also in relation to the economic aspect of stability, and not least the economic aspect of mitigation potential, and also of the multiple ecosystem services, which we believe closer to nature management will better serve than the classical forest management. This would be, I think, very important, not least in order to persuade practitioners, forest owners to move in this direction, but also in relation to maybe develop financing mechanisms which really will be in accordance with the transition in Europe towards a CO2 zero situation in 2050. Because if we are able to prove and to show that the close to nature management approach will basically be able to store more CO2 in our forest in general, and also to store it in a more stable way, then there should be financial mechanisms in order to pay for that. So we believe that this should be looked into, and maybe we can find here a nice way to pay for this ecosystem service, which will be storing carbon in a safe bank. Then at the end, we feel also in order to create ownership and momentum in this transition, it is important to develop a plan and to develop incentives for a pan-European knowledge exchange, collaboration, and demonstration forest. This being said, I think I have come to an end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bo, for those reflections. I think that's all we have time for here. So I'd like to ask Stefanie and Bo, perhaps you could take a look in the Q&A box where there are a couple of questions and type an answer to them separately, if that would be okay. And in the meantime, we'll move on to our panel discussion, which is going to be moderated by Bernhard Wolfslohner, who's the head of the governance program at EFI. So I'll hand over to you, Bernhard, to introduce the rest of your panel.
Okay, thank you, Rach. First, let me thank you, both Stefanie and Bo, for setting the scene. I think it was very interesting also to bring these two documents also together. We all know that it has quite some history, and a lot of work went into these definitions and also proposing the way forward. So thanks for that. And to dig a little bit deeper, will also lead us now to the panel discussion, where we have 4 panelists. So first, I mean, it's not housekeeping rules, but some recommendations, as you did already for the first speakers. So if you have questions to one of the panelists, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A box that you find on the bottom of the screen. So please indicate to whom you want to raise your questions, but also indicate your name and the organization that you represent, so that we can hopefully select the one or other question at the end of the panel discussion. Introducing briefly now our panel. So I would like to welcome our 4 panelists. Our first one is Thomas Robert, who is the Director General of the Forestry and Hunting Directorate of the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Food of Slovenia. So he's been working primarily in the public forest service. He's an expert in forest technology and forest road, and has also been working as Assistant Director of Public Forestry Service in Slovenia. Welcome, Tomasz. Then we have Eka Zenica. She's the President of ProSilva. He holds a PhD in silviculture, and he's been running a consulting bureau since early in his career. Apart from being also president of ProSilva Austria, he is also managing his own forest of around 850 hectares. So he knows, or should know, what he's talking about, also when bringing this back to the forestry dimension then. Third, we have Katja Matvainen, who is a chief specialist in the Natural Resources Department of the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in Finland. So among other things, she's responsible for the biodiversity measures in the Finnish National Forest Strategy, coordination and reconciliation of biodiversity and forestry in different national and EU level processes. So also connecting these different dimensions between a national means and the EU policy arena. And I think in the same line, we have last but not least, Stephen Dörr, who is a policy advisor from the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture in the European and International Forest Policy Unit. So he started his career working for the German Wood-Based Panel Association and the German Forest Owner Association. And he is now responsible for forest EU-related policies and representing Germany in the Forest Europe process, in all matters related to the European Forest Institute and the Integrate Network. So welcome all of you, dear panelists, and I suggest that we jump into medias res since time is flying. And of course, I will guide you through 2 rounds of questions if time allows. And we start with ladies first, of course. Katja, welcome here on this panel. My first question would be, so if I'm informed correctly, so there have been discussions on closer to forestry, closer to nature forest management guidelines in the Finnish context pretty just recently. And I would like to give us a little bit of a judgment of what are the opportunities for implementing them, in particular the Nordic context, because we've also heard that there are many different contexts across Europe. So how do you see this for the Nordic context?
Thank you so much, and I'm glad that you invited me here. Yes, we actually had yesterday a discussion about the guidelines in the Finnish context, and also as a broader boreal context. We had a presentation from Stefanie as well as from our Swedish colleagues, and then turning to Finnish, discussing about retention forestry and closer continuous cover forest management, which are the main approaches that we in the boreal region use. We had over 100 participants throughout the day, so we were there for the whole day discussing these issues, and it seems that the concept is interesting to Finnish participants. So what did we then discuss? I will just give a few points. Wood-based industries continue to be important for Finnish economy. Last year, the roundwood removals were about 75 million cubic meters. And we were wondering that most probably it would not be possible to harvest this much if we would use only closer to nature forest management in Finland. There might however, be some forest owners that could be interested in this approach. we kind of have two starting points where we can enter the discussion. One is the disturbance-based model that has been researched quite a lot in Finland by Timo Kuuluvainen and his colleagues. And when starting from that point, it is evident that the share of continuous cover forest management should increase in Finland because now it's only a few percent at the moment. But the natural disturbances that occur here, naturally they would tell that it should be more. However, we should remember that there are also large-scale disturbances. They are very rare, but they are present. So the continuous cover forest management would benefit those species that are dependent on forest conditions, such as bilberry, and those species that are associated with it, such as the capercaillie. However, most endangered species, they really don't care about which forest management method you use, but you should take care of retention of living trees, dead trees, and deciduous trees, as well as the key habitats. Actually, the most prominent discussion from the 1990s has been to increase these structural features that are important for forest species. And from the discussion that we had yesterday, it seems to be the case still that we are still discussing about the structural features. But my feeling is that there will be a growing interest, and we are definitely going to look at the possibilities that this closer to nature forest management concept has. Thank you.
Thank you, Katja, for this first insight from the north. I think it's always good to hear that we are really sort of the point of time where also the discussions are taking place, and that it's not some theoretical approach only. We move a little bit south to Slovenia and to Tomáš. Now a question, so since the forest management in Slovenia has always the flavor of being very close to nature already. So the question is this true? How do you judge this? And what, from your experience, could you say that which practices are well established already to support the implementation of the closer to nature forest management guidelines already at this stage? Can you share some experiences with us?
Yes, thank you, Bernhard. I would like, first of all, to thank the organizers, European Forest Institute, for the opportunity to discuss such an important topic that can be crucial for the future of European forests. For me, the essential question, what we are talking about when we are talking about close to nature forest management. Because things have to be named and defined as well as possible. We cannot manage something if we don't know what the tools are. The question of close to nature forest management is not simple, it's not plain, because as we heard, European forests are very diverse in ecological sense, and following adequate measures also different. Now, more directly to the answer, Slovenia way of closer to nature forestry. Since 80s, in the last century, when I was a forestry student, we learned the close to nature doctrine as a basic principle of forest management and so-called Slovenian Forest School. But closer to nature as a higher level, I asked myself, perhaps rhetorically, how high can we go? Will we come too closest to nature? Did we really make a step further, or is this just one more strong word because of the fear of climate crisis? We know about greenwashing critics. Has this described graduating perhaps something to do with forest washing? We must answer us also this question. And finally, let me explain the main principles that we practice in Slovenia as I said, close to nature forestry. First of all, we practice no clear cuts. I find it essential as a first point. It is regulated in the forest law, and follow that provide the second point, that is natural regeneration. We plant extremely little in forests. We manage the forest in the way of natural regeneration with site-adequate species. This way we found the cost is effective and site-adopted species are more resistant. Third, the basis for forest planning is in Slovenia phytosociology. Simply explained on some examples, on lowlands, oak stands, we raise oak and hornbeam forest and not a spruce. On beech and fire strands, we raise beech and fire and other species from this association, and so on and so on. Next thing is that we are converting the planted spruce forest before, especially in the lowlands, to site appropriate forest stands. In this sense, also bark beetles, a site of high economical use, are close to nature factor as well. And the last one, we are a bit conservative when involving new cutting technologies and always consider potential negative effects on forest stands and forest soil. This will be shortly from my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for giving us a first insight into practical aspects already, but also, of course, the issue about that we have different definitions and different ways. Our challenge is also to communicate, which then leaves me to Stephen as the next question, because I guess that you have many of different now modern forest management concepts on the table. So we're of course dealing with sustainable forest management, integrated forest management, rewildering, closer to nature forest management. So now from your day-to-day experience, how do you judge the difficulties or the challenges to promote all these concepts, that they really reach the ground in the end? And where do you see synergies, or where do you see some problems in really digesting all those concepts?
Yeah, thank you, Bernhard, and also thank you for inviting me to this panel. Indeed, there are nowadays a lot of different concepts with different names that represent different management approaches, different priorities and different objectives of management. And maybe from my perspective, but I think the challenge here is pretty similar across Europe, is that the increased number of concepts that we are now experiencing also reflects the increased societal debate on the role of our forests and the role of forest management, especially in view of the climate and biodiversity crisis that is so visible in our forests. But what I want to underline here is that we are not starting from scratch with all these new concepts, as one may assume, because these new concepts focus especially on the protective functions of our forests. we're not starting from scratch. On the contrary, we're since decades, since long, forest science and forest practice have taken into account different forest functions, the variety of forest functions, and always aiming to find the best management solution for the particular local circumstance or the particular local demand that is being placed on forests. So the variety of concepts also kind of reflects the variety of our forests and their functions. And it also reflects the fact that there's not a one-size-fits-all management solution. However, and I don't want to take a step back here whatsoever, but given that the fundamental concept of sustainable multifunctional forest management is open and dynamic and evolving, and we're currently revisiting it under the German presidency of the Forest Europe process. In our view, this still provides all the tools necessary for us, for our forest owners and for our forest managers to grow, first of all, resilient forests as the foundation for any forest ecosystem services provision, to improve their biodiversity and to also contribute to mitigating climate change. So in this regard, from my point of view, it is only problematic with all these concepts if we assume that different forest functions or different concepts promoting either the one or the other forest function are mutually exclusive or even contradictory. Unfortunately, in times where simple messages seem to dominate the public discourse, it doesn't have to be on forests, this goes for all sectors or for all topics pretty much. We are indeed oftentimes led to believe that this is the case, that it is the case that these different concepts only serve one function or are mutually exclusive or contradictory even. But it's not, and that's what I want to point out here. These concepts and guiding principles, they are all choosing from this toolbox that we have, from the toolbox of sustainable forest management, and trying in the best case to maximize, on the one hand, the provision of ecosystem services, while on the other hand, and at the same time, trying to minimize respective trade-offs. So if we identify and manage the trade-offs in the frame of sustainable forest management, we can already be on a pathway of synergies and thereby trying to ensure also on a larger scale, if we look at Europe from a large scale, that our forests can fulfill their essential functions for our society, even in an uncertain future with changing climatic conditions. Yeah, that would be my take on the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So the message is, let's agree that not our only message will be everything is too complex to handle, but really seek synergies out of these concepts. We will find out that many of them are not exclusive, not mutually exclusive, but we should really seek how we could bring them together. Which, of course, relates me to a colleague with rich experience in these kind of questions, Eckhard. So when you listen to this debate on closer to nature forest management, so is this something that you perceive as a new concept, or is this something that has been in the very core of ProSilva activities anyway? So where do you see some new elements? What is similar, but where there might also be differences from your point of view?
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, your question is clear. Of course, ProSilva goes back to more than 30 years, and the principles that were published in 2012 were developed in the years before. The whole concept in general goes back maybe till 100 years in different European countries. So we have not one source of this concept in one country. We have parallel development, and we had difficult discussions, especially in the years in the 50s and 60s. So when when First World War was over, so not just timber production was in the focus, so there was a change in thinking. And these discussions are ongoing since 50 years. And in some phase, this procedural approach was really in the corner, and now it's moving in the center, and that makes me happy. If you go back to the papers and the principles that are already published, mainly in 2012, the main topics that we are discussing now were already touched and already the principles were defined. So even good management of carbon, energy, Mediterranean forest, adaptation to risk, biodiversity, the discussions about how to integrate non-indigenous tree species into natural processes was discussed, and there were a good list of criteria developed. This all goes back to Jean-Philippe Schütz with great respect. He passed away in April this year, and we have the duty to keep his legacy. So I think what's new here in this paper from European Commission, one tiny thing is they are closer and not close to nature, which is, I think it's a kind of public relation trick, but I think it's a good idea to define a kind of direction. We should move to closer. We're not close, but we should move closer. So this is a process that takes time. And what's often forgotten in all these discussions is what is the forest history? What is behind us? Not just the picture and the virtual background behind me. What is the origin of the forest we are now talking about? We have large areas where forest was removed and the landscape was changed to agricultural pasture land, and now we have a change back. So these are plantations on former agricultural land, like we see in Ireland, for example, or maybe also in England, but we have the same in Austria, in Czech Republic, etc. So the soil has to change. We have to go on to convert these unnatural forests to more natural forests. This is one big task. And on the other hand, I think what's very interesting in the development of these guidelines is that the broad stakeholder involvement. That's really very a long process and a broad process, and this is a very this helps the acceptance. I think yeah, this is important. And what also is important, not just have papers. We need the forest I show in my background, but we need to go out in the forest, and we have to convince people with examples, and not just with the example of the forest, but also with the examples of the forest managers who can explain how they do it, and they can convince people. Papers will not easily convince people. Maybe it's important to have a scientific basic, and I really appreciate also these self-critical remarks that Bo Larsen gave in his shortcomings. This is very important. One point that he pointed on is the economic aspect. One of the key motivation to go closer to nature forestry, also 30 years ago, for several that are applying this, was the economic motivation. It gives more timber with less input, less investment. Of course, but this is another point that's contradictory. It seems to be contradictory, is that the basic principle of closer to nature forestry in the sense of ProSilva is a biodiversity function. We need this before we start to produce timber. So this doesn't mean that we have to protect and take management out of the forest. That means that we need a healthy basic for forest growth. And this is the soil, and this is also the structure of the forest. And in some discussions also about climate change mitigation, we focus on tree species. You say maybe Abies is better than silver, than spruce or something like that. That's not one, that's just one aspect. We don't have to focus on tree species alone. We have to focus on the mixture of the species and on the structure, because the structure helps the forest to protect itself in the sense of managing water circular processes within the forest and not lose the water. And then the forest will be weak and will be attacked by bark beetles. That's just one short example. I think I don't want to go longer, then I can have some more remarks later, and we should have a discussion that covers different aspects. Thank you.
Thank you, Eckhart. So yeah, you're right. So there are many aspects in there, some of them quite nicely pointing out that what has been mentioned also, for example, by Stefanie, so the importance to show best practices, but also this exchange, so that it's not just a theoretical concept, but it's really something that has to be practiced on the ground, also learning from the background, so to say, and the history, why we are here and where we can go from here. So quite a lot of interesting aspects. One you mentioned was also the economic aspect as a main driver. And this brings me back then to Katja for a second question. It's basically about the forest owners as main actors in this game. And how do you judge the openness from, for example, Finnish forest owners to closer to nature forest management with full respect of the potential economic impact? So has this been discussed already? So how can this be judged from a Finnish perspective, how to integrate these economic considerations into closer to nature forest management?
Thank you for the question. Somewhat we have discussed this. First, as a background, we have a lot of private forest owners who have quite small holdings. The holding size is about 30 hectares in Finland in average, and there are I don't recall how many hundreds of private forest owners. So and it should be noted that their views should be respected about how they really want to take care of their property. According to the studies that we have made, there's about 20% of forest owners that do think that safeguarding biodiversity better than the existing legislation and for example, certification could be their aim. So this is the 20% that we perhaps should target first. Then about the economics, we discussed yesterday that even in continuous cover forest management, you should take care of the retention trees, because in that kind of management method, it is the largest trees that you normally take out. So you should really take care that there will be also these old trees or habitat trees left. So the more you leave the retention trees, the more expensive it would be for the forest owners, as an example. And a key question is then who should pay for this extra? Is it the forest owner? I doubt that they would go for it unless they would get better paid. If there would be the market for these kind of trees that I saw in Slovenia, so they would be extra large, large volume, and they would get more money. There's probably not markets at present in Finland for that kind of trees. Then should should it be compensated by public funds? well, we probably don't have enough funding for everything. And then, yeah, would it be then the consumer who pays? But we probably don't have the models. And we come then back to the question about payments for ecosystem services, for example, that was already discussed. So yeah, I think that there might be some interest, but yeah, the economic impacts are the ones that probably are hindering the development. And then yeah, about the attitudes. Yeah, you have the 20%. You can go first target that part.
Thanks a lot, Katja. I just have to look at the timer simultaneously, and so thanks for that. So there is still a mile to go. That's what I hear. I would like now for the remaining speakers, so let's keep the answer short so that we still have some time also for answering questions from the podium. This was not a criticism on you, Katja, but it's just on me as a timekeeper. Reminder that we have to stick to the clock. Good. Thomas, briefly about, of course, we heard about the severe floodings and devastations in Slovenia. And of course, the questions may arise if closer to nature forest management is something that can also help to restore or reshape forests in the future. So we come now from the more forest protection side also. So how do you judge this in a few sentences?
Yes. So the fact is that Slovenia is strongly affected by climate changes in the last 10 years under different weather storms. So that crisis forest management with rehabilitation plans made by public forest service became the new normality of forestry management in Slovenia. We presume that in the future we can expect the same or even worse scenarios. So I would underline two starting points, two basic points. First is that thanks to the high percent of forest, it's 60% in Slovenia, and thanks to close to nature forestry, as described before, the consequences for the whole society, in the case of floodings and some other damages events, significantly lower. So we want, with some new improvements, continue our way of close to nature forest management. And secondly, the importance of public forest service, which covers all the forest and steers the forest management no matter of ownership. This found be very important for the future. Now Slovenia Forestry is asking himself, how can we adapt the system to be more effective in the time of climate changes? First, we have to change some legal and administrative procedures, that's for sure. Secondly, in the focus of high flows this year, we have to better design, to better construction and better maintenance of forest transport routes. Then we have to put greater attention to ensuring the protective functions of the forest. Then we must better implementation of the post-harvest order. We have to focus on the forest stand stability more. And last but not least, the detection and action against invasive alien species is and will be more and more important.
Thank you, Thomas. I think we can all understand there's quite a lot of actual measures required after such disasters. I think this has closely to be related also to all these activities in closer to nature forest management. Thanks for this. Also, you hinted at the role of forest owners once again, and that there might be not so much difference. where there might be a difference, Steve, and this brings me back to you, is the issue of how to communicate these concepts then to forest owners, to private forest owners, and to really make a difference on the ground. So where do you see some challenges here, and what might be proper avenues to go?
Yes, thank you, Bernhard. Okay, so you do target the question to forest owners. I was more envisioning the broad range of stakeholders that we have, but I think when it comes to communication, this is indeed very critical, and I think forest owners oftentimes feel somewhat misunderstood in what they do and the great work that they do. So from my point of view, key in communication is to try to move away from always having these desk discourses, as I would say them. We're sitting behind our laptops and distributing our messages, and different parties are distributing different messages. And here again, we have the problem of these simple and short messages that I already touched upon previously. So the major challenge here is, I think, also from a science perspective, is to try to find ways to simplify our messages as much as possible. We need positive and emotional messages. We need to be transparent in what we do and why we do it. And again, this is what Eckhart also already mentioned, which is super important in our view, is to go into the forest, get away from the desk and go into the forest where the management is actually practiced on the ground. And here in the forest, we can reach all different stakeholders. We can reach the general public. We can reach forest owners and forest managers that can also still learn a lot, and who are always ready to learn more. And we can also reach and address politicians that then make policies on how to manage our forests. And that's one reason why we, and I have to advertise for this here a little bit, one reason why we established the network of now more than 220 demonstration sites in the frame of the European Integrate Network, especially with the goal to show, okay, what kind of consequences does a certain management activity has on forest biodiversity, and to try to show that there are synergies, and that you also have to, of course, identify and manage trade-offs, what I also already said. But being in the forest, this is what really, what can really bring the discourse forward, and also try to create a sense of understanding among all different stakeholders on these forest management concepts that I think in the end basically have one common shared goal, which is the integrity of the ecosystem and the provisioning of the ecosystem functions. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So also, I think this is, of course, addressed to the broader collection of stakeholders, not only the forest managers. You're right. Good. Looking at the time, Eckhart, and since you've answered quite a lot of points, I ask you a very short and crisp question at the end. So, because we're already talking about activities. So what can ProSilva contribute or offer to the implementation of closer to nature forestry guidelines as they are now proposed? Very crisp question to you.
That what all our member organizations are doing since centuries, since decades. We offer excursions, we offer discussion, we show exemplary forests. And in the meantime, also different ProSilva members are involved in different projects. And the main goal of these projects is teaching, training. They are developing online trainings, but also, of course, trainings in the forest. That is done in France in several several projects. with some countries involved. So it's moving forward. And also we have an example from Finland, where we have a member organization that is developing teaching material already. And they told us that 70% of the Finnish private owners want to switch to continuous cover already. So this is important to have this basic on the ground in the forest in training. And of course, also publications are important. So I just received a mail 2 days ago from Arne Bommer-Renning, who published a work also focusing on Scandinavian countries. So this is interesting that's moving on forward. That's the main thing. I think the key issue is motivation of the forest owners, and this may happen with incentives, financial incentives. And we need a subsidy system that supports good examples, successful examples, and not just repair measurements that we're focusing now after these calamities. And I think I finish with one point. We have to keep our eye on the interest of industry. Industry wants a supply of timber. And sometimes it seems that industry has contradictory interests than this closer to nature forest management has. But this should be the same. I think forest owners and also industry needs economic resilience. And we are far from that in some areas. I think I should be short, so thanks.
Super, that was a very good concluding remarks. So I think we've touched a certain level of a red line at the end right now, talking about concrete activities, next steps, and also how to create synergies in this topic. I think this was as far as we could go. And with this, I would hand back over. So first, of course, let me thank you, dear panelists, for really being very crisp and clear. And let's see whether there's still some open question. I also see that we have a little bit of time constraints. I will head back over to Rach. Rach, please.
Thank you. And just to say thank you all for the many questions in the Q&A box. And thank you to the panelists and to Stefanie, who have kindly answered them as we've gone along. I'm not sure we actually have time to answer any of the questions directly now. And I think because of these time constraints, I'd like to hand over to Janez for the closing words.
Thank you, Rich. By the way, the first thing which one could conclude after a really rich seminar, it's time flies. You learn that if you are in my age, but you learn that also when you are managing the time of the panel. So it's never enough, in particularly if the topic is so interesting as it is the one today. Sorry. So I think it is no-brainer when we talk about forests of their importance. So importance in many contexts, and in particularly today we spoke in the context of the climate change, but if you would look to the scientific facts, forests and biomass management, it's even more important in the context of biodiversity loss and water stress. Anyway, what I wanted to say on the basis of today's discussion is that it was very clearly explained by Stefanie what is the role of European Commission in this kind of type of initiatives. On one hand, of course, keeping an eye and understanding that there are differences all across Europe in different regions, but on the other hand, the Commission has always a role to keep the ambition high. So you need to keep those two things together. And if you want at the end to do what is supposed to be done with this kind of initiatives to come closer to the nature management. So Tomasz was pointing us, like many of you, on a very diverse approaches, definitions, and so on. And one of interesting things which I actually took from his contribution was that also in the context of forests, we have to be careful about greenwashing, or he named it forest washing, but it's an important aspect which we have to take in mind. Stephen was talking about different concepts, names, objectives of management, but the bottom line of his message was we have to talk about the role, the role of the forest in various kind of aspects. And this is one aspect which we have to take into consideration, but it's not the only one. And it was nicely reminded by Bernhard that while we have to take into account the complexity, we also have to simplify it in a way that it's implementable, that people understand it, and that we can actually take the actions which are bringing us into the certain direction. Eckert was reminding us that actually it's not new, that it's very nice that Commission is actually introducing additional R into the concept, so closer to nature, not close to nature, because it is a process. And if I can share with you any lesson, yes, it's always time which is needed for the changes. And it's important that we understand that with the repetition, we would come to a critical mass of understanding, and also with a lot of contributions which are coming from the scientific world, where you actually don't know why and how, but this critical mass happens and the things start to move in the right direction. So it's important that we understand the things in that way and that we take that into account, which leads me to back to Bo. And actually, I would like to mention two things on which he was pointing his contribution and assessment of the Commission's approach. One is related to the importance of adaptation. So that was also clear from the Tomáš explaining the situation in Slovenia. And one thing which I think it's important that we start to get and that we start to understand is that fragility is expanding. So Slovenia was known as on the sunny side of the Alps country, but this summer was everything but on the sunny side of the Alps. So there are more and more regions which are becoming fragile, and this is not something which can only be linked to the, I don't know, to the Southern Europe or to the Northern Africa or whatever countries which we know that are more fragile from this point of view. So I think it's really important that we learn the lessons, that we get better prepared, but at the same time that we not lose an eye, because at the end it's investment which needs to be done in both directions, that also prevention needs to be one of the core part of the business, but we have talked a lot about prevention today. The second aspect, which many of you actually mentioned, was about the economic aspects, or as Eckert very clearly said, economic resilience. So it's indeed, at the end of the day, it's market, which it's decisive. Unfortunately, the market incentives which are today existing, or market are not consistent at all with the aspirations of regulation many times. So market is sending us producers and consumers in the direction which is not really protecting the environment, many times on the contrary. And better alignment between these incentives, including those who are coming from the public sector, like Common Agricultural Policy of the Future, which I think it's quite a critical question. Will we integrate that very much solidly in these transformational efforts? I think these are important elements which we have to take into account. He was also reminding us on the importance between policy and science. And I think, of course, somebody who was responsible for both needs to be very clear. And for me, that is very clear. My experiences are that, unfortunately, policymakers many times are taking as much science as fits into their interest scale. But it needs to be very clear that this critical mass of science is something which guides the policy and decisions which are done in the policy space, which leads me to the importance which today maybe we haven't mentioned a lot, but we need to understand that whenever you talk of any specific area, and this area was in particular important, we need to think and put it in the context of the system change. Our major problem is that we have created a wasteful economic system. It is wasteful. So we use too much energy and natural resources for meeting human needs, which could be met with much less. And when we talk about sufficiency, we don't talk only about having less. On the contrary, in IRP in particular, we talk about that in the context of using less natural resources and using less energy for meeting some human needs in a more efficient way. And that's not exactly the sufficiency like we are immediately thinking about of having less and then opposing not to have it. So a really important thing, which many of you mentioned, is also this social acceptability. Katja mentioned smallholders in Finland and the importance of them. All that, I think, needs to be taken into consideration. So what is important, that at least from my point of view, is that we do not look to a single goal, which we have it in European Green Deal, that's zero GHG 2050, net zero 2050. But in the same sentence, it's also decoupling of resource use from and environmental impacts from economic activity and our well-being. And we need to make those things consistent. And everything what we do needs to keep that consistency. So simultaneously reaching multiple goals, not only looking to reaching climate change for whatever it will cost, but it has to be done in a smart way, which integrates different kind of aspects and different kind of goals into overall future. So, for example, when we talk about something which is also a very well-known concept, this circular bioeconomy, I think cascading story, and again, Katja mentioned that wood-based industry has aspirations in Finland about using the wood more in that. Yeah, this is nice opportunity, but it's really, really important that the things are done by protecting ecosystems and actually using the wood capacity and forest capacity in the best possible way in containing the climate change and other environmental challenges. Which, by the way, the last sentence in Global Resource Outlook 24, we will not talk about sectors anymore. We will talk about provisioning systems. And I can tell you in advance that provisioning system of food, which is very much connected to biodiversity, to biomass, which is connected to food industry, to agriculture, but it's connected to a large extent also to forestry. It's quite critical, in particularly in biodiversity, water stress, but also in the climate change aspect. To conclude, I would like to thank you all, in particular all of you who have been contributing actively to our panel. In the name of Helga Maria, European Forest Institute. So thank you everybody for being with us. More will come from the FE side. And yes, going into the forest helps a lot, not only of learning everything what you have heard today, but also for keeping you fit and with good physical and mental health. Good luck and take care.
Thank you very much, Janez. Thank you so much to all our speakers today and participants. It's been an extremely interesting webinar. I think lessons learned for next time, we need to allow even more time to tackle the enormous volume of questions that we had. But thank you so much, and we look forward to connecting with you all again soon.